And so I saw a news story today, which was, pretty important story, but it wasn't necessarily like the top of the list in terms of all of the things that are happening, because it's something that happens so often that even though it's noteworthy and it's meaningful and it's impactful and it's, awful for the people that are involved, it's kind of just something that happens in the same way that there are car accidents every single day. Usually they're not front page headlines. People get cancer, people die from not having health insurance, not front page headlines. Shootings all the time in the U.S. Most of them don't get front page headlines unless they're of an elementary school. It's just kind of something that happens. We know that it happens, and it's not really a big surprise. And so today what happened is that the U.S. decided to bomb Syria. And so that's something that the Biden administration just did, which is also something that the Trump administration has done and the Obama administration has done. And prior to that, what the Bush administration did is we didn't bomb Syria because back then the Assad government was our allies, and we would send our detainees, the CIA would send their detainees over to the Assad government for what was called extraordinary rendition, and they would have them tortured there because, it's, here in the U.S. we have things called human rights laws, and torture is kind of like, something that you're not supposed to do too much unless you do it in Guantanamo Bay or in some secret CIA black site. And so an easier thing to do for the Bush administration would be to send those detainees over to other oppressive governments around the world, and then have them torture them for us. And so that's what we did under the Bush administration. A few years later, we are bombing Syria for the Obama, the Trump, and then now the Biden administration. It's just something that happens, no big deal. So for me, what's interesting is to compare how the left institutions, like the Democratic Party and the kind of the liberal media, the mainstream media, CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, which was kind of part of the hashtag resistance. Democracy dies in darkness was the Washington Post slogan, that the Never Trump movement. They had strong criticism of Trump, usually I agreed with, but it seems to me as if the same events were carried out oftentimes by, other administrations, and when that was the case, or is the case, currently with the bombing of Syria by the Biden administration, they have a very different frame in which they impose on what is effectively the same event. Actually, just a quick tangent. It was just announced like a couple days ago that the Biden administration opened up their first detention facility for migrant children. And if you remember, like the number one complaint that the hashtag resistance had with Trump was he's throwing these children in cages. And this is unconscionable, and this like a huge, this is a terrible thing, which I agree with, like it's a terrible thing that happened. But a similar thing, if not exactly the same thing, but a similar thing happened under the Obama administration, not necessarily with the child separations, but with, more or less a contiguous policy along the borders, and now it's continuing under the Biden administration, except for now when Biden opens up a immigrant detention facility. First of all, it's not cages, so there's walls, so we aesthetically place the children in walls as we detain them, as if like the metal bars like makes it that much more dehumanizing. They're contained within a box, like that's the main event that's happening right there. But when this happens, like the New York Times does a long, explanation of this is a complex, nuanced issue, and we can't be too quick to condemn, which is a complex situation that you have to consider all the factors involved with. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not true. In general, I still don't agree with the policy. But if it's true now, it was true under the Trump administration as well. Except for back then, it was a lot easier to get clicks and to rile up your extremely left liberal Democratic Party oriented base of readership. I saw a poll that 95% of the New York Times readership is liberal and Democratic leaning, which is higher than the percentage of Fox News viewers, which are Republican, which is 93%. So they're telling them what they want to hear. They're riling them up. They're getting clicks. They're earning money for it. And now when Biden's doing the same thing, they have to rebrand and repackage what is effectively the same event. Now the same thing is happening with the bombing of Syria. And so I'm going to put these tweets up. The first is from Jen Psaki, who is the White House press secretary under Biden. Before that, she was, very hypercritical of Trump. And so when Trump bombed Syria, her position was, I don't have it right in front of me, obviously, because I'm in the forest. But pretty much what she said is, I think it's important to bomb Assad because, again, the Democrats, they love bombing people and they usually support the wars. But again, it's a tightrope to balance between, making sure that we support the wars while also criticizing Trump. So it kind of put the Democrats in a predicament when Trump bombed Syria. And so she was like, I think it's important that we attack Assad because he did terrible things, which again, yeah, he did do terrible things, but so do our allies, and we never attack them because the money's flowing in the right direction, and they're part of the U.S. orbit. So that's something that Jen Psaki would never criticize, is a U.S. ally like the United Arab Emirates or the Gulf states. Or if they do criticize them, it would never be like in the context of we need to bomb and overthrow this government. We don't overthrow our allies' governments. We overthrow governments which are not in our order. But the tweet, again, it said, support the war. Like, Assad did terrible things. He gassed people. He did this. He did that. But we're worried about the constitutionality of this process, meaning, like, you can't just unilaterally start bombing people. Kamala Harris had a similar tweet. She was obviously the vice president now. She's like, yeah, no, I'm concerned about. So they need to find a way to be like, oh yeah, no, I'm with you in spirit in terms of starting another war, but I'm worried. I still have to criticize you in one direction, so I'm going to criticize the process, which again was legitimate. You can't just start bombing people unilaterally. Fast forward to today, and the Biden administration starts bombing people unilaterally, the same exact government as during the Trump administration, and Kamala Harris is the vice president, and presumably she's in support of it and would never criticize it because she is the administration, and same thing for Jen Psaki, and same thing for pretty much the entire left liberal ecosystem. And people wonder why they don't trust institutions and they don't trust the Democratic Party or politicians. It's because they stick their finger in the air and they say whatever is necessary in order to benefit their immediate political interest, while also continuing to support the military-industrial complex and special interests and the powers that be. So we're always supporting wars, but we're just going to frame it in a way that, that benefits the Democratic Party. We're always supporting child detentions, but we're going to frame it in a way that benefits the Democratic Party. We're always in favor of outsourcing and trade deals and tax cuts for the wealthy, from one degree or another. But we're going to frame it in a way that makes it seem like when Trump does all these things, it's the worst thing in the world. But when the Democrats do it, it's not at all. And so what we have is a inconsistent, sensationalized, clickbaity form of media from all these main institutions, which are putting spin on events which are relatively common, usually, throughout administrations in a way that criticizes the red team and criticizes the orange fascist, as they like to call them, endlessly for bad things. And then when the same thing is done by the Democratic Party, the spin is to justify and rationalize these same things while talking about the aesthetics of how presidential he was and how this. I'm not saying there's no difference between the parties. There's actually substantial difference, but a huge amount of the bad things which are done are universal, and the reason that the trust for institutions and the media and politicians and everyone, like the truth is under assault, and people do not trust their ears anymore in the same ways that they did during the Walter Cronkite days. One of the main reasons for that is because these institutions are feeding their viewers what they want to hear. Just like Fox News is never going to criticize Trump, or very rarely does. And so, in the end, you have a bunch of, old zombies that, believe, every single thing that he says or tweets. A very similar thing happens among the Democrats, and both sides self-righteously feel like they are defending the country against the other. This is a bad situation. There's just a poll that showed that both liberals and Democrats think that the biggest problem with the country are like each other. So Trump supporters think it's the liberals think that it's Trump supporters, and there's some truth to each of that. Especially, again, I'm more liberal than I am a Trump supporter, that's for sure. But the dynamic is very, very similar, and people aren't able to see it. And events like this, I think, illustrate it well. One more little wrinkle I'll put on that: General Lloyd Austin is the one who ordered this. He was the first black general. It was the main story, like the first black general. Look how progressive and different the Biden administration is than the Trump administration. We're putting in a black general as the head of the Defense Department, who happened to also be sitting on the board of directors for Raytheon, getting paid, by a company which makes money selling bombs to blow up people. And now look, he's using those bombs to blow up people. Conflict of interest, something that maybe the media should comment on. Not really important. We have the first black general. And so the wrinkle is that, the left media and the left liberals have so internalized kind of a vapid, vacuous form of identity politics and cultural war woke signaling that it's, elevated all the way up to the Defense Department. Like the most important thing about the Defense Department is not the skin tone or the melanin content of the people blowing up the other people. I'm going to put this little meme on the screen, which I thought was interesting. Maybe I'll use it as my thumbnail, which I think summarizes the situation well. And so it's not good. It's not good, but I thought that was something I would comment on.